It was supposed to be a peaceful getaway, a weekend trip to get away from the noise of the city, from work, from the constant hustle and bustle. Just me, alone, with nature. The cabin sat in a small clearing deep within the woods, far enough from the nearest town that I couldn't hear the hum of traffic or the occasional shout of someone walking down the street. It was the kind of place where you went to escape, and, if I'm being honest, it's the kind of place that scared me a little. But I needed this. After the months I'd spent working myself into exhaustion, I needed the silence. The drive to the cabin was long, but it didn't feel like that at first. I was eager to get there, listening to the hum of the engine and watching the scenery change as the city faded into nothing but winding country roads and fields. As I got closer to the woods, though, the sky turned gray, and the trees seemed to grow thicker, taller, more claustrophobic. The roads got rougher too, and as I reached the last stretch of the journey, I was bumping along a dirt path, the tires skimming over gravel and loose rocks. The air grew cooler as I neared my destination, the heavy scent of pine trees mixing with damp earth. It smelled like the kind of place that had been untouched by man for centuries, and I liked that about it. I liked that no one had been around to mess things up. There was something comforting about knowing that everything here had a kind of raw beauty, untouched by time. The cabin appeared before me like a mirage through the trees. It was small, rustic, exactly what I had been hoping for. A simple wooden structure with a sloping roof and a stone chimney that looked like something out of a storybook. There was a porch with a few rocking chairs, weathered by the elements, and a faint trail of smoke curling up from the chimney. I parked the car and stepped out, taking in a deep breath of cold, fresh air. The silence was immediate and overwhelming. No birds singing, no distant sounds of animals. Just the rustling of leaves, the gentle swaying of trees, and my own breath. It felt almost unnerving at first, but I shook it off. I grabbed my bag and walked toward the front door. It was locked, but I had the key from the cabin's owner, a distant relative who I barely knew. I let myself in, the door creaking loudly as I pushed it open. Inside, the cabin was everything I had imagined. Wood floors, an old stone fireplace, a couch, and a single chair in the corner by the window. There was a small kitchen, a tiny bathroom, and a single bedroom with a large, old-fashioned bed that looked inviting. I could already feel myself relaxing just being there, knowing I had the entire place to myself. It was everything I had wanted. I unpacked quickly, setting my bags down and starting a fire in the fireplace. The crackling of the wood, the warmth spreading through the room, it was exactly what I had been craving. The sun dipped lower, and the cabin grew darker. I lit a few candles around the room, their warm glow flickering against the wooden walls. I cooked some pasta for dinner, the aroma filling the cabin. By the time I finished eating, it was fully dark outside. The night was heavy, quiet, and the only sound I could hear was the crackling of the fire. As the night stretched on, I started to feel that strange sense of unease again. I couldn't pinpoint what it was. It wasn't fear, exactly, but something that lingered just beneath the surface. Maybe it was just the isolation. Maybe it was the way the shadows in the corners of the cabin seemed to move with the flickering candlelight. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was all in my head. I decided to go to bed early, figuring I'd get a good night's rest to make up for the past few exhausting weeks. The bed was surprisingly comfortable, and after a few minutes of tossing and turning, I drifted off. I woke up to a noise outside. First, I thought it was just the wind, the kind of wind that makes branches creak and leaves rustle. But then I heard it again, a soft scraping sound, almost like something, or someone, was moving along the outside of the cabin. My eyes snapped open, wide awake. I lay there, listening, my heart pounding in my chest. The wind had picked up, but it didn't explain the scraping. It was as if something was dragging against the wood, just below the window. The sound stopped, but the unease stayed with me. I turned my head slowly, glancing at the window. It was dark outside, nothing but the flickering shadows cast by the trees. I told myself it was nothing, probably an animal or just the wind. I closed my eyes and tried to go back to sleep, but the noise had shaken me. I couldn't stop thinking about it. There was something unsettling about the way it had sounded, the way it seemed to be deliberately scraping against the walls of the cabin. It wasn't like a random animal trying to get inside. It felt too intentional, too careful, too methodical. After a while, I finally fell asleep again, but it wasn't restful. Every sound, every rustling twig outside, made my heart jump in my chest. The night seemed to stretch on forever. The next day was quiet, too quiet. I spent most of the day reading, occasionally stepping outside to take in the view of the woods, but there was no one around. No other signs of life except the wind and the trees. I tried to enjoy the solitude, but by nightfall, that feeling of unease crept back in. I decided to take a walk before dark set in, thinking some fresh air might help clear my mind. I grabbed a flashlight, locked the cabin door behind me, and set off along a narrow trail that cut through the woods behind the cabin. The trail was overgrown, the earth soft beneath my feet. Felt good to stretch my legs. The woods were eerily quiet. No birds, no animals, nothing. Even the wind had died down, leaving only the sound of my footsteps. I walked for a while, trying to push away the feeling that I was being watched. The further I went, the more the forest seemed to close in on me. The trees grew thicker, their trunks dark and twisted, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands. I finally turned back, realizing how far I'd gone. I hadn't meant to wander so deep into the woods, but as I made my way back toward the cabin, I noticed something strange. There were footprints in the dirt. They weren't mine, too big, too deep. Someone or something had been following me. I stopped, my heart thumping in my chest. The prints were fresh, the edges of the dirt still disturbed. I didn't know how long they had been there, but the thought of someone else being in these woods, so close to my cabin, made my skin crawl. I turned quickly and ran back toward the cabin, not daring to look behind me. I barely made it inside before I heard the scraping sound again. It was louder this time, more pronounced, like something heavy was being dragged across the porch. I slammed the door shut and locked it. My heart was racing. My mind was spinning with questions. Who could be out there? What did they want? I grabbed the pocket knife I had found earlier, more out of instinct than anything else, and waited. Every small sound outside seemed magnified. The night stretched on in tense silence, and I eventually fell into a fitful sleep. When I woke up the next morning, the sun was just starting to rise. I didn't remember falling asleep, but I had. The cabin was silent. I felt like I had been holding my breath all night. My eyes scanned the room, and I realized something. The door had been opened. It wasn't wide open, but the latch was no longer in place. The wind couldn't have done that. I grabbed my flashlight and checked the outside of the cabin. No signs of forced entry. No footprints leading to the door. Nothing out of place except for the door being slightly ajar. The scraping sound, the footprints in the dirt. It didn't make sense. I knew I had to leave. I couldn't stay here anymore. Not with the constant feeling of being watched, the strange noises, and the unmistakable signs that someone, or something, was lurking just outside. I packed up quickly, grabbing what little I had unpacked, and hurried out the door, locking it behind me. I didn't look back. I didn't want to know what was still waiting in the woods. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been watching me the entire time I was there. Maybe it had been the silence of the forest itself, or maybe there really was someone out there. But I didn't care to find out. I drove away from the cabin, my hands gripping the steering wheel tightly, my eyes scanning the rearview mirror. The woods stretched endlessly behind me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed, that the forest was watching me as I drove away, its quiet, ancient eyes seeing everything. I didn't stop until I was far from the woods, far from that cabin, and I didn't go back. I never considered myself the kind of person to go camping alone, let alone in a secluded cabin deep in the woods. It seemed too quiet, too isolated. The idea of being completely cut off from civilization had always unsettled me. But when my old friend Ethan invited me up to his family's cabin for a weekend getaway, I thought, why not? It had been years since I'd seen him, and I was in desperate need of a break. I was stuck in the grind of city life, constantly distracted by work, and the idea of being away from everything for a while sounded like a nice escape. The cabin was located in a remote area, hours away from the nearest town, down a dirt road that twisted through dense forest. Ethan swore it was safe and peaceful. The family had been using the cabin for generations. But I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that settled in my stomach the longer I thought about it. I drove up on a Friday evening, the sun beginning to dip below the horizon as I made my way through the winding roads. The trees grew taller and closer together, their thick branches intertwining above the road, blocking out most of the fading light. The only sound was the crunching of the tires on the gravel. My phone had no signal out here, and the radio picked up nothing but static. It felt like the world was slowly being swallowed by the forest. When I finally arrived at the cabin, I felt a sense of relief. The place was small but cozy. The wooden structure sat nestled in a small clearing, surrounded by thick trees that seemed to encircle it, their shadows stretching long across the yard as the sun disappeared completely. A single porch light flickered above the front door, casting an eerie glow. I stepped out of the car, stretched my legs, and took in the fresh air. It smelled of pine and damp earth, the kind of earthy scent you only find in the woods. The air was cool, and a light breeze rustled through the trees. Ethan's car was already parked out front. I grabbed my bags and made my way to the door, knocking softly. No one answered. I let myself in with the spare key that Ethan had given me. The door creaked as I pushed it open, and a wave of musty, old wood hit me. The cabin was simple, an old-fashioned stone fireplace, a couple of worn leather chairs, a small kitchen, and a single bedroom with a large window that looked out into the trees. It was quaint, if not a little too quiet, the kind of place where time seemed to slow down. I figured Ethan was out for a walk or doing something outside. I left my bags by the door and wandered through the cabin, getting a feel for the place. The living room was warm and inviting, with a large rug in front of the fireplace and shelves filled with old books. There were a few windows scattered throughout, their wooden frames painted white, but they were mostly covered by heavy curtains. The place seemed untouched by time, like it had been stuck in the 70s. I decided to light the fire to stave off the evening chill. As I bent down to start the fire, I noticed something odd on the floor, a small, old-fashioned pocket knife, lying on the rug near the hearth. It was weathered, the blade slightly rusted, but still sharp. I wondered briefly if it had belonged to Ethan or his family, but there was something about it that made my skin crawl. It seemed too out of place in such a peaceful setting. After a moment's hesitation, I picked it up, examining it. The handle was carved with intricate designs, worn smooth by years of use. The weight of it felt strange in my hand, like it was meant for someone else. I tossed it on the mantel above the fireplace and went to the kitchen to grab some food. The evening passed slowly. I unpacked, made dinner, and set out a bottle of wine to enjoy while I waited for Ethan to return. The cabin was peaceful, yes, but there was an odd feeling hanging in the air. The silence outside seemed to seep into the cabin, pressing down on everything. I tried to shake off the unease, telling myself I was just being paranoid. By the time the sun had completely set, Ethan still hadn't returned. I wasn't worried at first. Maybe he was out for a late-night hike or doing something else around the property. But as the hours dragged on, I started to feel a sense of dread. The longer I waited, the more the silence outside seemed to grow louder. I decided to go outside and look for him, but the moment I stepped onto the porch, I froze. The forest around me was so quiet, it felt unnatural. There were no crickets chirping, no rustling of leaves in the wind, just stillness. Even the wind had stopped. I called out his name, but there was no answer. My voice seemed to get swallowed up by the trees. I stood there for a few minutes, waiting for some sign of him. Nothing. The only sounds I could hear were my own breathing and the faint rustle of the trees above me. I started walking toward the woods, but the further I went, the more uneasy I felt. The air was thick with tension. Every sound I heard made my heart race. Footsteps, twigs snapping underfoot, a branch moving in the breeze. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching me from the shadows. I walked in a slow circle around the cabin, trying to find any sign of Ethan. The trees seemed to grow closer, their branches swaying and creaking in the wind. I was about to turn back when I noticed something strange. A faint light moving between the trees. It was dim, barely visible through the branches. I stood still for a moment, watching it flicker. I figured it was Ethan with a flashlight, but something about it didn't feel right. The light wasn't moving in a steady way. It flickered erratically, like someone was walking through the woods but constantly pausing, almost as if they didn't want to be seen. I started to walk toward the light, but the moment I did, it disappeared. I stood still, waiting for it to reappear, but nothing came. My heart began to pound. The quiet was unbearable, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I decided to head back to the cabin. I turned and started walking toward the porch when I heard something else. Movement in the woods behind me. It was slow, deliberate, like someone was following me. I spun around, but I saw nothing, just the blackness of the trees. I sprinted back to the porch and slammed the door behind me, locking it. My pulse was racing. I tried to calm myself down, but the feeling of being watched wouldn't go away. I grabbed my phone to call Ethan again, but there was no signal. I couldn't even get a text to send. Minutes passed, or maybe it was hours. Time seemed to slow. I couldn't shake the anxiety gnawing at my gut. I finally decided to take a shower and try to sleep it off, but I couldn't relax. The cabin felt like a trap now. The air was thick and suffocating. Just as I started to drift off, I heard a loud bang outside. It came from the side of the cabin, near the back door. It was followed by another, then another. I jumped up, my heart pounding in my chest. I grabbed the flashlight from the nightstand and crept to the window, shining the beam out into the night. I froze when I saw what was standing outside. It was a man, a tall figure, dressed in dark clothing, standing perfectly still in the middle of the clearing. He didn't move. He didn't even blink. I didn't know what to do. I considered calling the police, but there was no signal. I had no way to reach anyone. The man remained motionless, staring directly at the cabin, his face obscured by shadow. My mind raced. Was it Ethan? Had he brought someone with him? Why hadn't he told me? Why was this person standing outside my window, not moving? I quickly ducked out of sight, holding my breath, praying that whoever it was would leave. The banging stopped, and the man remained outside, unmoving. I waited for what felt like an eternity, my pulse thumping in my ears. Finally, just as I was about to peek through the window again, I heard the sound of footsteps retreating into the woods. I dared not move, too afraid that he might see me. But after a few minutes of silence, I felt it was safe to check again. There was no one there. The clearing was empty, but the unease didn't leave. Couldn't sleep. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, something I wasn't supposed to see. I never thought I would be the type of person to go out to a cabin in the woods alone. I've always been more of a city person, surrounded by people, noise, and convenience. But when my friend James invited me to stay at his family's cabin for the weekend, I decided to take a leap. James had gone on and on about how serene and beautiful it was up there, and for once, I wanted to disconnect from everything. No phones, no social media, just peace and quiet. James had planned for a group of us to go, but last-minute cancellations left me as the only one who could make it. I tried to back out, but James insisted it would be fine. It was just one weekend, and the cabin was fully stocked with everything I'd need. I figured it would be a nice, relaxing getaway, even if I was alone. The drive up there was uneventful. Just me, my car, and the winding roads that slowly took me deeper into the forest. As the miles passed, I found myself surrounded by tall trees, their branches swaying gently in the breeze. There was something peaceful about it, until I realized how isolated it was. No gas stations, no other cars, just me and the road. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I arrived at the cabin. It was nestled deep in the woods, far away from any town or civilization. The cabin itself was old, but not falling apart. The kind of place you'd expect to find in the middle of nowhere. A small porch with a rocking chair, a few windows that let in the fading sunlight, and a chimney that looked like it had been used more times than I cared to count. Inside, the air smelled like pine and old wood. The furniture was basic but comfortable. An old couch, a small kitchen table, a couple of chairs, and a stove. There was a fireplace that James had promised would keep the cabin warm during the colder nights. The whole place had an odd charm to it, like it was stuck in time. After unpacking my stuff, I decided to take a walk around the cabin. The surrounding forest was dense, and the trees towered over me, their shadows stretching long as the sun began to set. I walked down a narrow path that led to a small creek, the sound of water trickling over rocks soothing. I spent a few minutes just standing there, listening to the flow of the water, feeling like I was finally getting away from it all. The sky darkened quickly, and the temperature dropped as I made my way back to the cabin. I locked the door behind me and set up a fire in the fireplace. The warmth from the flames was comforting, and I spent the next hour reading a book by the light of the fire. But as the night wore on, I started to notice something strange. There were no sounds coming from the forest. No rustling of leaves, no chirping of insects, no animals moving through the underbrush. It was as if everything had gone silent. It's hard to explain, but it was unnerving. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was just the stillness of the night. I was alone out here after all. I settled into bed, the fire crackling in the background. The wind picked up outside, and the old cabin creaked and groaned as if settling into the night. I pulled the covers up, trying to ignore the odd stillness outside, but the silence was deafening. Then I heard something. It was a soft thud, almost like a footstep, but muffled. It came from the direction of the front door, just beyond the wall of the cabin. I froze, holding my breath. My first thought was that it was an animal, maybe a raccoon or a deer, something that had wandered too close to the cabin. But then I heard it again. This time it was closer. The unmistakable sound of footsteps on the porch. I couldn't tell if it was someone walking or something larger moving around. My heart started to pound, and I sat up in bed, trying to listen more intently. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment, everything went quiet again. I waited, straining my ears for any sound, but nothing came. The silence in the cabin felt suffocating now, like the walls were closing in. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe a stray animal. Maybe the wind had knocked something over. But the feeling in my gut told me something wasn't right. I grabbed the flashlight from the nightstand and crept toward the window. I cautiously pulled the curtain back just enough to peer outside. The beam of the flashlight cut through the darkness, but there was nothing there. No movement, just the stillness of the night. I exhaled, relieved, but still uneasy. Maybe I was just overreacting. It was a quiet night, and the woods had a way of making you feel like you were being watched, even when you weren't. I lay back down, trying to calm my racing heart, but as I settled back under the covers, I heard it again. This time it was louder, a scraping sound like something or someone was dragging something heavy along the porch. My blood ran cold. This wasn't the sound of an animal anymore. It was something else, something deliberate, something that knew I was inside. I grabbed the flashlight again, and my hands shook as I turned it on. Slowly, I approached the window once more, shining the beam out into the darkness. This time I saw something, a shape in the shadows just at the edge of the porch. It was crouched low, almost like it was hiding. I couldn't make out what it was, but the figure was large, too large for a person. And it wasn't moving like a person either. It was more like an animal, slow, deliberate, but with a strange kind of purpose. I felt a surge of panic. My heart was pounding so loudly in my ears that I could barely hear the creaking of the porch beneath the figure's movements. I could see the outline of something long and thick trailing behind it. Something heavy. I didn't know what it was, but I didn't need to see more. I grabbed my phone from the nightstand and dialed James's number. It rang, and I waited, hoping that he'd pick up. But the call went straight to voicemail. My stomach churned. He was hours away, and I was alone out here. I couldn't just sit here. I had to do something. I grabbed my jacket and quietly slipped out the back door, making sure to lock it behind me. The cold air hit me like a slap, but I forced myself to stay calm as I crept around the side of the cabin, trying to get a better look at the figure. The flashlight beam danced in the darkness, but the figure was gone. For a moment, I stood there, staring into the empty night, wondering if it had been my imagination. Maybe it was just a trick of the light, or maybe an animal. But the weight in my chest didn't go away. Something was out there. I circled the cabin slowly, checking all around, but there was nothing. The woods were eerily quiet again. No sign of movement. I felt like I was being watched, but every time I turned, nothing was there. Finally, I went back inside, locking the door behind me. I checked all the windows, making sure they were secure. Then I tried to settle back down in bed, but sleep wouldn't come. The silence in the cabin was suffocating, and every creak of the walls made me jump. I don't know how much time passed before I heard it again. A sound from outside the cabin. This time, it was unmistakable. It was right outside my window. The scraping sound was louder now, as if something was trying to claw its way into the cabin. I held my breath, my hand gripping the flashlight. My mind was racing, but I couldn't make sense of it. It wasn't just a random noise anymore. It was deliberate. It was someone or something trying to get in. I had no choice. I grabbed my things and ran out the front door, not bothering to look back. I didn't stop until I reached my car, hands shaking as I fumbled to unlock the door. The engine roared to life, and I sped down the winding road, my heart still racing. As I drove, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something following me. But there was nothing. The woods behind me were dark, empty. I never went back to that cabin. There are too many things I'll never understand. All I know is that something was out there watching me, and it wasn't just an animal. And I wasn't about to stick around to find out what it was. I never thought I'd find myself alone in a cabin deep in the woods, especially not in the middle of nowhere. I had always loved the outdoors, but something about this place felt different. My friends and I had planned this trip for months, a weekend getaway to disconnect from everything and escape the city life. The cabin was remote, advertised as the perfect escape for those seeking peace and solitude. No cell service, no distractions, just nature. What more could we want? But then things went south. My friends bailed out last minute, and I didn't want to cancel. I convinced myself that a weekend in the woods would be good for me, a chance to clear my head. I had no idea what I was getting into. When I arrived at the cabin, I was greeted by an overwhelming silence. No hum of distant traffic, no voices, nothing. The only sounds were the wind in the trees and the occasional bird call. The cabin itself was small, tucked away in a dense thicket of trees. The wood was weathered, and there was a faint smell of old pine and must in the air. A small porch with a rocking chair creaked under my weight as I stepped onto it. Inside, the furniture was simple but functional. A small couch, a coffee table, a wood stove, and a kitchen area. It had all the essentials for a comfortable weekend, if you didn't mind being completely off the grid. The first night was peaceful. I cooked myself a simple meal and spent the evening reading by the fire. The crackling of the logs was the only sound breaking the silence, and for a while, I found comfort in it. The cabin felt like a cozy refuge from the outside world. But as night deepened, the woods around me grew eerily silent. It wasn't the peaceful silence I had experienced during the day. It was as if the woods were holding their breath. The wind had stopped, and there were no more animal noises, no rustling of leaves or chirping insects, just an oppressive stillness. I dismissed it, telling myself that maybe it was just the isolation getting to me. After all, I'd never been out here alone for long stretches before. I finished my book, stoked the fire one last time, and climbed into bed. The cabin was pitch black at night. No streetlights, no moonlight filtering through the trees, just complete darkness. I lay in bed, listening to the occasional creak of the cabin settling, the wind picking up slightly outside. I thought I heard something in the woods, maybe the crack of a branch breaking or an animal moving, but it was so faint that I wasn't sure. After a while, I drifted off to sleep. Then, I woke up to the sound of footsteps. They were slow and deliberate, heavy enough to make the ground beneath the cabin shift slightly. The footsteps came from outside, just beyond the windows, as if someone, or something was walking around the cabin. My heart started to race, and I felt a cold sweat prickling down my back. I didn't know what to think. Was it a person? Was it an animal? I strained my ears, trying to discern more details, but everything else was silent. The footsteps stopped for a moment, then started again, this time a little closer. My mind began to race with possibilities. Could it be someone else out here, maybe another camper? But who would be out here at this hour? I grabbed my flashlight from the nightstand, trying not to make a sound. I didn't want to alert whoever or whatever was outside. My breathing felt loud in my ears, and my fingers fumbled with the flashlight. It clicked on, casting a weak beam of light across the cabin. I held it tightly, almost nervously. The footsteps continued, circling the cabin. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end as I lay in the dark, listening. Whoever or whatever was out there was moving in a strange pattern, stopping, then starting again, slowly, methodically. It wasn't the frantic scurrying of an animal. It wasn't the casual stride of a person. No, this was different. It was too careful, too deliberate. For what felt like hours, I lay there, frozen, unable to move or make a sound. I didn't dare call out. I didn't want to alert whatever was out there to my presence. My mind ran through all the scenarios. Maybe a hunter had lost his way, or perhaps a hiker had wandered off the trail. But the more I listened, the more my gut told me something wasn't right. Eventually, the footsteps stopped. The silence returned, thick and suffocating. I didn't know whether that was better or worse. My mind was racing, and I couldn't stop myself from imagining what was out there. I told myself I was overreacting, that it was just an animal or some harmless wanderer. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The air felt charged, heavy with anticipation. I lay there in the dark for what felt like forever, until I heard a sound that made my blood run cold. A low scraping noise, like something was dragging along the side of the cabin, slowly, quietly, as if it didn't want to be heard. I swallowed hard, my throat dry, and held the flashlight tighter. What the hell was that? The sound was coming from the back of the cabin, just behind the small porch. I could hear it moving around, the scraping sound getting closer, like something was pushing against the cabin's walls. It wasn't a human sound. It didn't feel human. I thought about grabbing my phone, but I knew it wouldn't do any good. No signal, and even if there was, who could I call out here? There was no one for miles. I was completely alone. I had to know what was out there. I had to look. I grabbed the flashlight and slowly, quietly, crept out of bed. My heart was pounding in my chest as I moved toward the window, the one closest to where I had heard the sound. The beam of light flickered as I pointed it through the crack in the curtains. For a moment, I saw nothing but the inky blackness of the night. The wind had picked up again, rustling the trees, but the eerie stillness was gone. The air was colder now, and I could see my breath misting in the faint light. Then, there was movement in the shadows. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, but then it moved again, slowly, deliberately, and I realized with a shock that it was something large, something human-shaped. The flashlight beam wavered in my hand as I focused it on the figure standing just beyond the window. It was tall, almost too tall, and it was bent forward, as if crouching or hunched over. The strange part was that it was dragging something behind it, something long and heavy. I could just make out the outline of a large, dark shape in the dim light. My breath hitched as I stared, frozen, not knowing what to do. The figure didn't move for a long time. It just stood there, still as stone. I didn't dare make a sound. I didn't dare move. Eventually, it shifted, and I saw something that made my stomach turn. A shape in its hands, or perhaps attached to its body. The flashlight beam didn't provide enough light to make out exactly what it was, but I didn't need to see more. I knew what it was. It was dragging something behind it, something that looked disturbingly like a body. I couldn't hold it in any longer. My heart was racing, my whole body frozen in fear, and I finally jerked back from the window, heart pounding in my ears. I needed to get out of there, but I couldn't. My legs wouldn't move. My mind was spinning with panic and disbelief. I had to leave. Now, I grabbed my keys and headed for the door, throwing on my jacket in a blur of motion. My hands were shaking as I turned the lock and swung the door open. The cold air hit me like a slap, and I couldn't even think as I ran out into the night. My mind was screaming at me to get away, to run as fast as I could. But when I turned to look behind me, I saw that the figure was no longer standing at the window. It was coming toward me. Without a second thought, I ran for the truck, not daring to look back. The engine roared to life as I threw it into gear, slamming the gas pedal down. I didn't stop until I was miles away, the cabin far behind me. I never went back. It was a last-minute decision, one that I had made on impulse. A weekend getaway to get away from the city, to clear my mind, to reset. I wasn't expecting much, just a small, secluded cabin in the woods. The kind of place where your cell phone has no signal, the only noise is from nature, and you can get some peace. I figured I would spend the weekend hiking, reading, and just letting the constant buzz of work and life fade into the background. The cabin was small but cozy. It had been advertised as off the grid, a perfect spot for solitude. When I arrived, the forest around it was thick, with tall, ancient trees whose branches intertwined to create a canopy, blocking out most of the sunlight. The cabin itself looked old, wooden with a slanted roof and a small porch that creaked under my weight when I stepped onto it. There was no power, no running water, just a wood stove for heat and a stone fireplace. It was simple, but to me it was perfect. I unloaded my things and set up inside. The smell of wood and earth filled the air, and everything about the place seemed to have an aged charm to it. I made a small fire in the stove to keep the cabin warm and unpacked my gear for the weekend. The sun was beginning to set, casting a soft golden glow through the trees, and I made myself some coffee to settle in for the night. The place was quiet, unnervingly quiet at times. The only sounds I could hear were the crackling of the fire, the wind rustling the leaves outside, and the occasional bird call. But it was that kind of peaceful silence where you start to feel every little sound. It was as if the cabin, the woods, and everything around me were alive in their own way, whispering in the background. That night, I sat in front of the fire, the flames casting flickering shadows on the walls. I read a book, then I ate some canned food. It wasn't gourmet, but it didn't matter. I was here to escape, not indulge. It was a strange feeling, though, this deep silence. I wasn't used to being so alone. As the night deepened, the fire burned down to embers, and the light from the windows disappeared into the surrounding darkness. I could hear the occasional rustle of leaves, and then the soft snap of a twig breaking somewhere outside. It didn't seem threatening, just normal. Animals, I thought. It was the forest, after all. I decided to go to bed early. I grabbed a blanket from the couch, crawled into the small bed in the corner of the cabin, and shut my eyes. It didn't take long before I drifted off into a light sleep, my body sore from the drive and the long day of traveling. But then, in the dead of night, I woke up. At first, it was just a vague feeling, a sense that something was off. The air had grown colder, and the room felt heavier somehow. I lay there, eyes open, staring at the dark ceiling. The cabin was still, too still. I didn't hear the usual night sounds, the wind rustling through the trees, the distant calls of animals, the movement of the forest. There was nothing, complete silence. I tried to shake off the feeling, but it lingered, gnawing at the edge of my mind. My eyes darted around the room, straining against the darkness, but there was nothing to see. Just the faint glow of the dying fire from the stove, casting strange, shifting shadows along the walls. Then I heard it, a soft scratching sound. It was so faint that I thought I imagined it at first. But then it came again, scratching, slowly, almost deliberate. It was coming from the corner of the room, near the back door. At first, I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a raccoon or a squirrel trying to get in. But then it sounded too methodical, too intentional. I held my breath, listening harder, trying to figure out if it was something I could explain. The scratching continued, but there was something else too, something heavier. A faint tapping noise, like someone was knocking on the wood. My heart rate started to pick up, and I felt a tightness in my chest. This wasn't right. I couldn't see anything in the dark. There was no light to illuminate the room, no way to check what was causing the sound. I felt stupid. Why had I come to a place like this alone? The woods were too quiet, too empty, and yet the sounds kept coming. Scratching, tapping, soft but unrelenting. For what seemed like an eternity, I lay frozen in bed, unsure of what to do. I couldn't just ignore it, not with how persistent the noise was. My mind was running wild, imagining every possible thing that could be making that noise. Could it be a bear, a wild animal trying to get inside? Could it be something worse? Then, without warning, the tapping stopped. I held my breath, straining to hear anything. The silence returned, but this time it wasn't the same. It was deeper, thicker, like the air had changed. Something was watching me. I could feel it, an eerie presence that seemed to fill the space around me. The cabin was no longer just an empty structure. Felt wrong. Suddenly, I heard a loud thud, followed by a scraping sound, louder than before. It was as if something or someone was dragging something heavy across the floor. The sound sent a wave of terror through me. I jumped out of bed, my mind racing for a reason, an explanation. I grabbed the flashlight from the table next to me and turned it on. The beam of light sliced through the darkness, illuminating the room in sharp contrast to the shadows. My heart was pounding in my chest, and every muscle in my body tensed as I swung the light toward the back door. Nothing. No one. The scraping sound was gone, replaced by an eerie quiet. I swallowed hard, trying to convince myself that it was just my nerves getting the best of me. Maybe an animal had gotten caught on something outside. But then the door rattled. It was slight at first, just a subtle shake of the handle. But then, more forcefully, the wood groaned under the pressure, like something was pushing against it, trying to get in. I felt a rush of adrenaline shoot through me. There was no animal that could cause that kind of noise. This wasn't just some wild creature. I was no longer in the safety of my cabin. I was somewhere else, somewhere unsafe, surrounded by the unknown. I grabbed my phone to call for help, but of course, the signal was dead. No bars. The battery was low, and I knew I wouldn't be able to call anyone even if I tried. I was completely alone. Another rattle. This time, the handle turned. Slowly, methodically. I couldn't stand it anymore. I had to do something. I grabbed the heavy, cast iron skillet that sat on the stove and moved toward the door, my mind racing. I wasn't going to just sit there and wait to find out what was on the other side of that door. Before I reached it, there was a sudden crash. The door flew open with such force that the frame splintered, and I stumbled backward, almost falling on the floor. My breath caught in my throat as the flashlight's beam illuminated the doorway. There was nothing there, just the cold night air, the empty forest, and the wide expanse of trees stretching out into the blackness. My heart was hammering in my chest as I stood frozen in the doorway, my mind spinning, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I could still hear the faint rustling of leaves outside, but it was distant. Gone was the sound of whatever had been scraping at the door. I don't know how long I stood there, staring into the night, but it felt like hours. The adrenaline was still coursing through me, making my limbs shake. I couldn't explain what had happened, and I didn't know what to do next. The woods were too dark, too silent. Finally, I slammed the door shut, locked it, and grabbed my things. Without thinking, I ran out of the cabin and straight to my truck. I didn't look back, not even once. As I drove away, the lights of the cabin faded into the distance. I don't know what it was that tried to get in that night. Maybe it was an animal. Maybe it was something else. But I wasn't sticking around to find out. When I got to the nearest town, I called the rental service to cancel the rest of my stay. I never went back to that cabin, and I never will. It had been a rough few months, and I was desperate to get away from everything. The noise, the people, the constant pressure. I needed space. That's how I ended up in a remote cabin tucked deep in the woods, far from civilization. My phone had no signal, and the nearest neighbor was miles away. It was the perfect place to disconnect and, for the first time in a long while, breathe. I had rented the cabin for the weekend, a small, isolated structure with no electricity or running water. It wasn't luxurious by any means. The walls were made of rough-hewn logs, the windows small and covered with mesh screens that let the fresh air in but kept the bugs out. The place had an old, rustic feel to it, like it had been there for decades, maybe even longer. The kind of cabin you'd expect in a horror movie, except I didn't care. It was exactly what I needed. I arrived late in the afternoon, and by the time I had unloaded my truck and set up inside, the sun was dipping behind the trees, casting long shadows across the forest floor. The air was cool and crisp, and the smell of pine and damp earth filled my lungs. I made a fire in the stone fireplace and cooked myself a simple dinner. I had no plans to go anywhere, and I was perfectly content. The night settled in quickly. Outside, the forest was alive with sounds. The rustle of leaves, the distant hoot of an owl, the occasional snap of a twig breaking. I didn't feel scared. In fact, the isolation was comforting. I was finally able to shut off my mind, to let go of the stresses of work and life. I grabbed a book and sat by the fire, its warmth and the flickering flames making the cabin feel even cozier. It was peaceful, and for the first time in weeks, I was able to relax. But that peace didn't last. It started off small, barely noticeable at first. A soft scratching sound coming from outside. I told myself it was just the wind or an animal brushing against the cabin. After all, I was in the woods. Animals were everywhere. But as the evening wore on, the sound grew louder, more deliberate. It was as if something or someone was trying to get my attention. I tried to ignore it, but the scratching continued, now accompanied by low, guttural noises. My heart began to race, but I refused to acknowledge my growing unease. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting dancing shadows on the walls. I tried to read, but every few minutes, I found myself glancing over at the window. The sound of scratching had stopped, but the unsettling feeling lingered, like a weight pressing on my chest. I couldn't help but feel like I was being watched. I decided to take a walk to clear my head. The night was cold, but the sky was clear, the stars bright against the blackness. The trees around me creaked and swayed, and I felt small in the vastness of the forest. But even though I was alone, the hair on the back of my neck stood up. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, like the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting. I walked for maybe 15 minutes, trying to convince myself it was nothing, just the woods being the woods. But as I turned to head back to the cabin, I heard something behind me, a sound like soft footsteps, barely audible against the crunch of leaves underfoot. I stopped and turned around, my heart pounding in my chest. There was nothing there. The path was empty. No one had followed me, but the feeling didn't go away. If anything, it grew stronger, like someone or something was out there, just out of sight, watching me. I quickened my pace, not wanting to linger any longer than I had to. When I finally made it back to the cabin, I locked the door behind me and went straight to the window, peering out into the dark. The forest was still and quiet, but my mind wouldn't let go of the unease that had settled over me. I sat down on the couch, trying to convince myself to relax. I reminded myself that I was just being paranoid. But then I heard it again. The scratching. It was louder now, coming from the side of the cabin. It was rhythmic, almost like someone or something was pacing around the perimeter. I stood up, my heart racing. There was no wind tonight, no reason for the trees to be making noises like that. This was something else. I grabbed the flashlight from the table and walked cautiously toward the door. I didn't know what I expected to find, but my instincts told me I needed to check. Slowly, I unlocked the door and pushed it open just a crack, shining the beam of the flashlight outside. First, I saw nothing, just the empty darkness of the forest, the shadows of trees stretching out into the night. But as I scanned the area around the cabin, the light fell on something. A shape. At first, I thought it was an animal, but the longer I looked, the more I realized it wasn't moving. It was crouched low, its body hidden by the tall grass, but I could see the faint glint of eyes reflecting in the flashlight's beam. Not animal eyes, though. These were different. They were too high off the ground, too large. I stepped back from the door, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know what I was looking at, but I knew it wasn't natural. Whatever it was, it wasn't supposed to be there. For a long while, I just stood there, staring at the shape outside the door. The scratching had stopped, but the unease only grew stronger. I was afraid to open the door fully, afraid of what might be waiting out there. So I did what I always do when I'm scared. I ignored it. I told myself it was nothing, that I was just being paranoid. But then, I heard something else. A loud thud. It was coming from the side of the cabin, followed by a scraping sound, like claws dragging against the wooden wall. I couldn't take it anymore. I've always been the kind of person who craves solitude. Not the loneliness kind, but the kind where I can just step away from the world, breathe, and unwind. After a long, stressful year, I thought a weekend in a remote cabin would be exactly what I needed. No Wi-Fi, no service, just me, the woods, and the silence. So when I found a small cabin tucked away in the middle of the forest, it seemed perfect. A true escape. I left the city early on a Friday morning, packed up my truck with a few essentials. Camping gear, some books, snacks, and enough water to last me a few days. The drive was long, winding, and as I got farther from civilization, the roads grew narrower, the trees denser. It felt like I was entering a different world entirely. By the time I arrived at the cabin, the sun was beginning to set, painting the sky with a beautiful orange glow. The cabin sat at the base of a hill, a modest two-room building with wooden walls and a chimney. It looked old, weathered, but sturdy. The kind of place that had seen better days but still had plenty of life left in it. I unloaded my things and quickly set up camp. The cabin was small but had everything I needed: an old wood-burning stove, a bed with a few blankets, and a table near the window. The place smelled of pine and old wood, with a faint hint of smoke from the chimney. It was peaceful, just what I was looking for. As the night crept in, I started a fire in the stove, sat in front of it, and cracked open a beer. The crackle of the flames and the silence around me was almost surreal. The forest outside was dark, but I could hear the occasional rustling of animals in the underbrush. I wasn't afraid of being alone. I'd spent time in the woods before, and the sounds were nothing new to me. I ate a quick dinner, then read for a while, but I was so tired from the drive that I decided to turn in early. I left the fire burning low and crawled into bed. The room was warm, and the smell of burning wood mixed with the fresh scent of pine through the window made everything feel calm. I should have felt at ease, but there was something about the silence that felt a little too still. The first few hours passed like normal. I drifted in and out of sleep, the occasional crack of the fire in the stove the only sound. Then, just after midnight, I heard something, a faint noise, almost like a tapping sound coming from outside the cabin. At first, I thought it was just the wind. The trees were swaying, and sometimes the branches would tap against the walls of the cabin. But this was different. It wasn't the wind. It was a deliberate sound, like someone was knocking on the walls. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding. The tapping continued, but now it was coming from the back of the cabin, where the woods were thick with trees. I didn't move at first. I thought maybe it was a branch, maybe an animal, but as the tapping grew louder, I started to feel that old, familiar unease creep up my spine. I grabbed my flashlight from the nightstand, my hand trembling slightly as I turned it on. The light flickered for a second before illuminating the room. I listened closely, straining to hear through the thick walls of the cabin. Nothing. The tapping had stopped. I held my breath, waiting for any sound. The room was dead silent now, except for the occasional pop from the stove. After what felt like an eternity, I convinced myself it had been nothing. I put the flashlight back on the nightstand and lay back down, trying to ignore the knot of tension in my stomach. But then I heard it again. This time it was louder, more insistent. A scraping sound, as though something was moving along the back wall. I froze. It sounded like claws dragging against wood. I grabbed the flashlight again, my hand shaking more this time. The beam of light illuminated the walls, the floor, the ceiling, but there was nothing. Just as I was about to convince myself I was being paranoid, I heard it again. This time, it wasn't from the back of the cabin. It was coming from the front door, a soft scratching as though something or someone was trying to get in. The cabin wasn't that big, and the front door was just a thin piece of wood with a single lock. I wasn't sure if I should check or just stay in bed, but the idea of staying still, of letting whatever was outside get closer, made my skin crawl. I stood up slowly, every muscle in my body tense. I reached for the door handle, but then I hesitated. What if it wasn't something I could handle? What if it was something dangerous? My mind raced, imagining all sorts of scenarios. But in the end, I knew I couldn't just wait. I had to check. I slowly moved to the door, the scratching now more persistent. It was like something was pawing at it. My heart thumped louder in my chest as I reached for the door. I didn't know what I was going to find, but I was determined to face it. I unlocked the door carefully, then pushed it open a crack. The night air hit me like a cold slap to the face. I shone the flashlight outside, my hands shaking as I tried to focus the beam through the dark. Nothing. The area around the cabin was empty, save for the trees and the moonlight filtering through the branches. But then, just as I was about to close the door, I saw something move in the shadows. A shape, a figure. It was hard to make out at first, but then I saw the eyes. Two glowing eyes staring back at me from just beyond the threshold. They were the brightest thing in the darkness, reflecting the light of the flashlight in a way that made my stomach twist with dread. For a moment, I thought it was a deer, or maybe a wild animal, but the eyes were too high off the ground. They were nearly level with my own. And then the figure stepped forward. It wasn't a deer. It wasn't anything I recognized. It was a dog, a large, shaggy dog, but its coat was matted and uneven, as if it had been living out here for years, its fur tangled and caked with dirt. Its eyes glowed unnaturally bright in the flashlight's beam, and its teeth were bared, as though it was ready to attack. The air around it seemed to pulse with an unsettling energy. I slammed the door shut, my heart racing. I locked it again and backed away, my breath coming in short gasps. The dog's eyes had never left me. They were still glowing, even though I couldn't see it through the walls anymore. I spent the rest of the night lying in bed, staring at the door, listening to the occasional scraping sound from outside. The dog didn't move, but I could hear it, pacing back and forth around the cabin. I knew it was still there, waiting. When morning finally came, I didn't waste any time. I packed up my things quickly, my hands trembling as I grabbed my gear and threw it into my truck. I glanced around once more before driving off, but the dog was gone. I didn't see any tracks, no signs that it had been there at all. But I knew what I had seen. As I left the cabin behind, I felt a sense of relief wash over me. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever that dog was, it was still out there, watching me, waiting.